Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 88, The Battles of Jena and Auerstedt. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if you'd like to support our podcast, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to Spotify, Apple, or YouTube and subscribe or follow us at any of those platforms. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a very famous, very prestigious, eminent guest on the line once again, the great Charles Mackay. Hello, Charles. How are you?
I'm great, John. How are you? Thanks for inviting me back.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For those that don't know, Charles has been on our show many times previously, has a great Twitter page, Bubbles the Vampire, which is a name that his son gave him for his Twitter page. And you also, I know you studied Napoleonic history at Florida State in your doctorate, which I'm hoping will be released maybe by the time this podcast comes out. What was your thesis doctorate on?
I wrote my dissertation on a general in Napoleon's army, General Jean-Andoche Junot, who is famous for lots of reasons, and not all of them good reasons.
Right.
But probably the most famous reason, he was a close confidant, early associate of Napoleon, and an intimate, and then also spearheaded the first French invasion, an ultimate occupation of Portugal in 1807, and lots of other things too.
Right, yeah. Charles is always working on something Napoleonic-esque. Great threads on Twitter, and I recommend you give him a follow.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
My pleasure. Today we're going to talk about the famous twin battles of Jena Auerstedt, which is a very intriguing set of battles on many reasons. There's a lot of myths and legends around these two battles, which occurred the same day. Here's a few. One myth, it quickly ended France's 1806 war with Prussia. It did not. And then another legend, which is true, is Marshal Davout fought off a Prussian army 3 times his size at Auerstedt. And then another is that Marshal Ney rashly charged into the Prussian lines at Jena and had to be bailed out by his brother marshals. So we'll dive into all these. And the two battles themselves, there's a famous quote that says, at Jena, Napoleon fought a battle he couldn't lose. And at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout fought a battle he couldn't win, end quote. What is your quick assessment of these two battles?
Well, that quote isn't too far from truth. I mean, if you look just at numbers, the French had ultimately built into such a numerical superiority by the end of the day, it would be hard to imagine how the well-trained and well-oiled, French juggernaut that it was in 1806 could have lost the battle at Jena. The one at Auerstedt is certainly a lot more interesting in terms of, because the French Davout's corps was grossly outnumbered, but a combination between the terrain and Prussian mismanagement, that did not go well either for the Prussians.
No.
These were two stunning, and after the pursuit, just complete total victories for the French.
Yeah, and the Prussians had a lot of history on their side. Obviously, the Great Prussian Army, Frederick the Great, it was supposed to be the best military in Europe. But it seems to me like researching the battles, they had too many chefs in the kitchen in terms of generals, where the French, they just had one guy, Napoleon, kind of leading the strategy, don't you think?
Yeah, and we'll get into it. There was an unfortunate event where the commander, the Duke of Brunswick, got killed in the middle of the battle, and King Frederick William, who was on the battlefield, did not appoint a successor, but didn't really take command either. So, it just kind of chaos.
Yeah. Well, let's provide some background info for our audience. In 1806, Napoleon and his Grand Armée had just humbled Austria and Russia the previous year at Ulm and Austerlitz. And despite many pleas from the Austrian Emperor and the Russian Tsar, Prussia remained neutral in that conflict. But then a year later, Prussia moves towards war with Napoleon. Do you know why they kind of took this stance after the war with Austria and Russia?
Well, In part, there was a little bit of dissension within the royal family and within Prussia itself. There was essentially a war camp and a camp that counseled more prudence.
Hmm.
The war camp actually was led by Frederick William's wife, Louise,
Hmm.
uh, who Napoleon at one point, derisively though accurately from his perspective, commented that Louise was the only real man in Prussia. So Frederick William was a little bit more indecisive, but ultimately the Prussians decided to get involved. But they decided to get involved at the absolute last minute. They set an ultimatum to Napoleon on the eve of the Battle of Austerlitz, basically threatening if the French did not evacuate from Germany, then the Prussians would get involved in the war. So, the next day that the French obliterate the combined forces of the Austrians and the Russians, and that missive from Berlin just didn't sit real well with the emperor, as you might imagine at that moment in time.
Yeah.
So their fate was sealed.
Yeah. And, obviously the listeners of this podcast know a lot about Napoleon. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Prussian king, Frederick William III?
Well, I think for our purposes here, the chief character trait of Frederick William was that, in fact, he was irresolute.
Hmm.
Uh, Making decisions did not come naturally. It was not something he was particularly comfortable with. He's beset by advisors on every side of any issue, either counseling war or prudence or whatever the case might be. Um, and Frederick William, there's a lot of deference paid to there's still a lot of veterans left from Frederick the Great's army, including generals and other officers, and even some enlisted men still in the force. So I think Frederick William was a little overpowered, probably by that shadow that Frederick cast,
Yeah.
the great Frederick the Great.
Yeah.
Um, and he was well-meaning. He was, in today's parlance, the measuring stick seems to be if you want to go have a beer with the guy, and he was a kind person. So I think by today's standards, people would want to go have a beer with him. But he probably just, he wasn't the ideal king for the situation at hand.
Right.
He
Well,
wasn't particularly militaristic, which, considering Prussia's stance, there was no other set of states in Europe that had a higher percentage of folks involved in the military than the Prussian state. Some 18th historians have called Prussia a military state.
right.
I'm not sure I'd be willing to go that far, but in terms of percentage of the population involved in the army and the percentage of the state's revenues that were dedicated to the maintenance and recruiting and salaries, it was far out of whack with the rest of Europe. But Frederick William wasn't that militarily minded, and he was more than happy to to let other officers and other nobles handle the military aspects of court life and decisions.
Yeah, it's just interesting to have a cautious king in charge of a militaristic society who is more of a wait and see kind of guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's give some background. I know this is the least favorite of describing a battle, but you have to describe the two sides opposing each other, and then we'll get to the battle. Napoleon had honed his grand army for years in the camps of Boulogne on the French coast. The Prussian army was renowned for their skill and discipline since the days of Frederick the Great. Napoleon had about 180,000 troops, while the Prussians and their Saxon allies had about 150,000 soldiers. Obviously, Napoleon's got a slight troop advantage. Were there any organizational advantages, one over the other?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And this might be even before the battles began. This might be the telling factor. Napoleon, and for most of your leaders, or most of your listeners rather, this is not going to be any great news. But for those that may not be familiar, the real flexibility and elegance of the French army was the fact that most of the soldiers were organized into what were called corps, and
Mm-hmm.
each of these corps had usually 3 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade or division as well.
Mhm.
And the construction or the organization of these corps was such that if any one enemy corps engaged or several enemy corps engaged a French corps, then that corps was to essentially, the design was that it could fight on its own independently for a half a day or so until other corps, French corps in the area, could march to the sound of the guns or to Napoleon's orders and get to the battlefield.
Right, which is different from the old lumbering giant armies of before, right? That had the big baggage trains and all that kind of stuff.
Correct. And the French corps had each corps had a corps commander that was set, and usually it was a French marshal. Not always, especially later in the empire, but at least for our purposes today, all of the corps that are going to be involved are commanded by marshals. And these marshals had permanent commands of these corps, and they had permanent staff.
Mhm.
So they're just much more efficient at getting done what needs to get done, and they can operate, somewhat independently. Some of these allied armies before, the highest permanent organizational level was the regiment, about 1,000 men.
Mhm.
So, and they would cobble these regiments together into brigades or into divisions, but they were often never permanent. So it made dispensing orders. One of the reasons that the Austerlitz, which is such a hassle for the Allies, was that, the amount of paperwork it took to get all of the regiments on the Russians and Austrians to get moving was just staggering. And when you have that kind of load, it's not as flexible. You're not as nimble. And this is the problem. One of the problems that the Prussians are going to find themselves in. Now, man for man, soldier for soldier, the Prussian soldiers were excellent soldiers. Good morale, disciplined. In a fight, straight up, they're going to give as good as they're going to get. And the Prussian cavalry had a reputation of being the finest in Europe.
Right.
Certainly one of the best mounted. But most of those tactics that the Prussians were still using were tactics that Frederick the Great had honed in the mid to late 18th century. And while many of them still held sway, some of them did not. The Prussians weren't the best skirmishers in the world. They didn't use their light cavalry to screen their numbers or to gain intelligence as well. Their artillery was certainly not as advanced as the French artillery. Again, most of your listeners will know this, but under the reforms of Griebel before the French Revolution, the French guns were all standardized. The parts were standardized. So if you had a part breakdown on one, you could use it for another. The barrels had been lightened in weight, but still strong enough to use regularly and over again. So there were just so many advantages that the French had in terms of artillery.
Yeah, and I remember even as late as 1815, the Prussians were hesitant to change. I remember the Duke of Wellington advising Blucher, like, "Hey, you shouldn't leave out your infantry just to get pulverized by artillery." And Blucher was like, "Yeah, we don't like to hide our numbers. We'll just stand out here and take it."
Well, Blucher was a bit of a dinosaur too. He plays a role in this battle, and I'm sure we'll talk about him a little bit later on.
Yeah, we'll come back to him. Okay, so getting back to our armies approaching each other, they're marching out, but it seems like neither side knew where the other would strike, and they're kind of just fanned out across the countryside, right? Can you discuss the battalion carré and what Napoleon's doing here?
Yeah. So, and you've hit the nail on the head there, John. The great flexibility the French have is in this kind of construction called the battalion carré. And essentially, it's that if you can picture in your mind a square, but it's not a square, you tilt it so it looks more like a diamond.
Okay.
And so what you got is that they're going to be corps on the left side, they're going to be corps on the right side, and then there'll be some corps in the center. And if Napoleon is advancing due north, as they're going to be in this situation, the presumption is that the point of that diamond will be the first point to make enemy contact. However, if it's not, if the enemy contacts the French on the left side of the diamond, which in fact happens here, then suddenly that left side is now the point of the diamond, and all the other corps file in to provide support.
Right.
So what used to be the center now becomes the right flank, and so on.
Ability to shift on a dime like that is really important.
Correct. And the 18th century army still had an advance guard, and then columns and things and such. And the French were much more. Napoleon's like, all right, let's go for it. This gives the French a lot more speed because they can advance on multiple pass multiple roads, and not necessarily be connected together. And Napoleon has both the confidence and the flexibility that if one of his corps commanders encounters the enemy, then he can pivot and, first of all, confident knowing that whoever makes first contact is not going to, run.
Right.
But also confident enough to know that the others are going to hustle up and provide support, and then Napoleon can get to the field and improvise a plan.
In theory, because in this particular case, one of the corps commanders does not hustle up. And, the famous thing about Auerstedt is the Davout-Bernadotte, Marshal Bernadotte relationship. And basically what happens here is Napoleon has his corps spread out over a wide area searching for the Prussians, which leads to the main controversy of the Battle of Auerstedt and Bernadotte's positioning. According to documents, Napoleon's orders to Davout were, quote, "If the Prince of Pontecorvo, who is Bernadotte, is with you, you may both march together. But the Emperor hopes he will be in position, which has been indicated at Dornberg," end quote. What happened the night before the battle? I know Davout and Bernadotte met, but there's animosity going back years between these two. They didn't like each other. So do you know what happened right before Auerstedt?
Yeah, and let me just back up just maybe a half step.
Sure.
So what Napoleon had intended to do was to leave from Bavaria and march north in the direction of Leipzig, and hope to encounter the Prussians somewhere in Saxony. What Napoleon did not count on was, in fact, for once, the Prussians had advanced further than he expected, both further south and further west.
Mm-hmm.
So as he's marching north, Lannes' corps bumps into the Prussians at Saalfeld, which is just south of Jena. And a lot of this is going to turn on that river Saal. There's a river that flows essentially southwest northeast, kind of cutting in that direction. Mm-hmm. And the battle is going to pivot. The Prussians are on the west side of the Saal, and the French are on the east side, which seems a little weird when you think about it. So in fact, the entire bulk of the French army is further east than the Prussians are. Mm-hmm. And so it looks like we're setting up. Napoleon, as you indicated, didn't really know where the Prussians are. They're in difficult wooded terrain. This is forests, steep hills here. And he finally gets some pretty solid evidence that the Prussians are, in fact, further west and south than he anticipated. And so he begins to sort of swing the army around. And so the intent is now Davout and Bernadotte, who were in the central column, Napoleon sends up further north and east to, in a sense, cut off the Prussian line of retreat.
Okay.
But here we get into some of the politics to which you alluded, and is a kind of a glimpse, a foreshadowing of the problems that Napoleon's going to have in the future. So Bernadotte is technically a prince, while Davout is not. And right. So Bernadotte doesn't particularly enjoy getting orders that might say, march with Davout, because, he thinks he should have a more exalted place.
Right.
And part of this is because of who Bernadotte married. Mm-hmm. Bernadotte was married to Napoleon's first girlfriend, Desiree Clary.
Right.
And so there's some sentimentality there, but it's even gets deeper because Desiree's sister married Joseph, Napoleon's brother. Mm-hmm. So Bernadotte is kind of sort of family. So right. Family by marriage, where Davout is not. Davout is just a really awesome marshal.
Yeah.
So I don't think Bernadotte appreciated the tone of the letter, and probably certainly not the spirit. I think if it had been worded differently, I don't know, maybe things have been a little bit different. Right. But the idea that Bernadotte would if the Prince of Pontecorvo is with you, you may both march together. So this is going to Devu and not to Bernadette. It's all just
Right.
It was a mess.
And we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that.
Gotcha. So those two corps are dispatched north and east to cut off the lines of retreat of the Prussians.
Okay. So the Battle of Jena commences in the morning of October 14th, 1806. How do things start off, and which forces are engaged? This is Napoleon's main battle group, right?
Correct. So what happens if we're talking about Jena? I'm gonna back up for just a hot second and do the Prussians. So
Okay.
after Laon made contact with the Prussians and Prince Louis at Saalfeld, the Prussians quickly decide that they need a better position and want to move north and east.
Mm-hmm.
So they're in that process of moving north and east when the battle commences on the morning of 14 October. So about 2/3 of the Prussian army have already kind of left the area of Jena and are in the area of what's going to be Auerstedt.
Got it.
And so what Napoleon thinks he's encountered is the main Prussian body, when in fact, I don't even think it's fair to call it a rear guard. I know some will, but I mean, it's a fat rear guard. It's almost 35,000 troops.
Right.
So I don't think it's as much as a rear guard as the Prussians that are left that have not yet relocated north and eastward.
Okay.
And so the French catch the Prussians rather flat-footed. And not unlike Austerlitz, it's a very foggy morning.
Mm-hmm.
So Laon manages to get across at Jena, get across the Saal, and gets a toehold on the plateau that's kind of above Jena. And then he's given orders to start pushing the enemy backwards so that the French can bring more troops across the Saal and come to terms with the Prussians.
And it seems like the battle is going well for Napoleon initially, but Marshal Ney kind of shows up on the scene. And what happens there, and why is this a problem for Napoleon?
Yep. So if you think of that, if you can picture in your head that original battalion carré, on the left side we had Laon, and behind Laon was Augereau.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that center column we had Davout and Bernadotte, who have been sent off to the northeast. So it's the right column that's coming around, that's composed of Soult, Ney, and the Bavarians. So what happens is Laon gets across, pushes off, Augereau comes across, sets up the French left flank, and then Soult comes in and becomes the French right flank on the battlefield. And they're steadily pushing the Prussians back. And then, God bless Ney. Ney comes thundering onto the field and sees a small gap between Laon in the center and Augereau on the left. And just, like the bull that he is, just led his corps there, which Napoleon had intended to keep him in reserve with the guard.
Right.
And he overextended, made such quick progress that he overextended. He did have to get bailed out a little bit by Laon and Augereau, but in retrospect, it ended up being, I don't want to say providential, but it ended up being a good thing, because there were 10,000 Prussians under Ruchel who were coming up from the southwest. It wasn't the end of the world that Ney went thundering across the battlefield there to get into the action.
Yeah, and you just have to know Ney. He's a glory hound. He doesn't care about anything else other than
absolutely. So it wasn't necessarily a problem for Napoleon. It wasn't exactly what he intended, but as with so many ways with Napoleon, it ended up being good luck, because just as the Prussian main body here of our 35,000 is starting to waver, Ruchel comes onto the field, and they're pretty easily dealt with.
Right. And yeah, it just seems like a good example of Napoleon improvising, even when your initial plan goes awry. Whereas the older Prussian generals, I don't think they're able to do the same thing, because they have to check with the princes and the king on what they're going to do before they do it, right? They can't just go on the fly like Napoleon is.
Now, exactly. Now there were some capable. Prince Hohenlohe was the command of the Prussian sectors in this area. He was not without some skill, and there were a couple of well planned counterattacks. Some of the villages changed hands several times before, finally becoming in French hands. So it's not like the Prussians are inept here. Remember, they've got these 35,000 have an impossible task to go back to what you said at the beginning. This is a battle that Napoleon can't lose.
Right.
By the end of the day, he does have the folks here in Jena outnumbered 3-1.
Yeah.
And so much advantages in cavalry and artillery, and it's overwhelming.
Yeah, and just to tie off Jena, Napoleon seizes the initiative, cracks the flanks of the Prussian army there, and wins his victory. Do you know what the casualty numbers were on both sides?
The Prussian casualties are just, horrific.
Yeah.
So at the end of this battle, the French are going to lose 5,000 or 6,000 at Jena and total casualties, and probably in the neighborhood of 7,000 at Auerstedt.
Mm-hmm.
But Prussian losses are 45,000.
Yeah.
And prisoners and casualties and whatnot. It's overwhelming.
Okay, so Napoleon's winning his victory at Jena. While this is going on, what's happening? A short distance away at Auerstedt.
Great question. So Davout has managed to cross the Saale and marches on to Auerstedt, where he makes first contact with Prussian cavalry.
Yeah.
And before him, Davout can see almost an entire field of nothing but cavalry, handled by our good friend, a well-known friend, Blücher.
Oh, yeah.
And Blücher, as soon as he sees the French, just heads straight for the French. So the first thing Davout does is to deploy his troops in square, because they're going to get.
Yeah, you receive cavalry.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And at this point, it's where the Prussians, the attack is poorly conceived. If Blücher had waited and brought up some infantry support or certainly some artillery, then the French are incredibly vulnerable in their square formations. A lot of this is like, I hate to reduce it so much as rock paper scissors, but in some regards, this is like rock paper scissors. If your infantry places itself in square, you're nearly, most of the time, impervious to cavalry attack. Your losses are going to be very small.
Yeah,
but
the same thing in Egypt. He just
absolutely.
Yeah.
But if you then roll up some artillery, then the losses are going to be at least twice as high, because and again, most of your listeners will know this, but in this part of the early part of the 18th century, most of the time when you're firing cannon, you're firing a solid ball. So it's not explosive. And the intent is that ball is going to hit the ground in front of soldiers and then bounce through the ranks.
Right.
And then, of course, it has so much weight and momentum that it's gonna go through multiple ranks.
Right.
So if you imagine yourself in a square formation, you're not just hitting 3 ranks in a line. Right. You're hitting 3 ranks in a line and maybe some on the flank, or you're hitting 3 ranks on the front line and then 3 ranks on the back line. Right. So infantry in a square formation is incredibly vulnerable to artillery, and likewise can't really respond all that well if they get hit by an infantry attack, because again, 3/4 of their troops are facing a different direction.
Yeah. But the opposing forces here in this battle is 24,000 for Marshal Davout and 64,000 for the Prussians.
Yep.
I did want to discuss the 3 commanders working under Marshal Davout, known as the Immortals, Gudin, Friant, and Morand. And kind of like you were talking before, the marshals got to, hone these corps for years. I know Marshal Ney had his 6th Corps for many, many years. So why were these 3 guys in Davout so talented, do you think, working together?
That's a great question. They became known as the Immortals, as you mentioned, and they served with Davout a good long time. and their personalities were actually a little different, but they worked well as a team. And part of that, I'm sure you've heard as a maximum many times, leadership starts at the top.
Hmm.
And I think the tone was well set by Davout about Davout as the Iron Marshal, and or became known as the Iron Marshal in large part because of this defense here and then attack at Auerstedt. And I maybe that conjures up in some people's minds that Davout was hard or uncaring, or uh, and he wasn't. He really, of all of the marshals, the best appointed corps was the Third Corps, because he was a great steward of the money that was handed to him by the French army. But he also, I mean, paid attention, that the level of detail that he paid attention to make sure that they had boots or coats or uh, ammunition or food, whatever it was that they needed. Davout took really good care of his corps. And of course, he's not going to brook any divisional commander or even any officers who are not completely in line with that ethos. I mean, he was professional to the core, with the possible exception of his appearance. We could talk about that if you want to. He was rather sloppy,
Yeah.
and his personal appearance, but everything else he had taken care of, and he did not brook folks that would not do that. So his leadership staff is all in alignment with sense of professionalism.
I think when you have a commander who is successful and has that level of detail, it only elevates your game, I would say, and this is a good case for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what maybe some listeners would like to appreciate more about Jena or Auerstedt in particular is that, um, again, this is in a sense a meeting engagement, and by that we mean that the French are moving southwest, the Prussians are coming up northeast, and they bump into each other. So
Hmm.
what that means is Davout does not have all three of his divisions on the battlefield to meet the enemy at first. It's only Gudin's division
Hmm.
that's on and immediately has to form square. And they occupy the center position. And then as Moran comes up, he takes the southern or the French left flank. And then Friant comes on and becomes the northern or the French right flank.
Hmm.
But what that meant was Gudin's division in particular suffered just one unit suffered 40% casualties. I mean,
Right.
these were just
Right.
crushing casualties. And all, Davout asked them to do was just hold on. I mean, just hold on. We got people coming.
Yep.
And the French did not break. But part of the problem was the Prussians just so poorly handled the elements that they had here. It did not help the Prussians that early in this battle, the Duke of Brunswick, the commander of the Prussian army, takes a musket ball through the eye,
Hmm.
and he didn't die instantly, but he died shortly thereafter. And
Hmm.
so now the Prussian army is left leaderless, and this is where Frederick Williams' leadership, or rather lack thereof, really, really hurt, because he did not appoint a successor, but he didn't really take command of the battle either. And in an army like the Prussian army, where everything was so relentlessly centralized, this, in a sense, is like cutting off the head of an octopus. You've got all these arms that could be uh, utilized, and they're leaderless.
Yeah, and yeah, by 10 a.m., the Duke of Brunswick's carried off the field, and by 11 a.m., after hours of playing defense and just getting probably hammered, Davout orders a counterattack and routs the remaining Prussians. Was their morale down, I guess, after their leader went down, or were they just like, we can't crack these French guys, we need to retreat?
So it was a great question. It was a combination of a lot of things. Obviously, losing the Duke of Brunswick, who was a sentimental favorite within the army, rattled. Anytime you're going to lose your leader like that, it's going to rattle morale a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, but they also started to hear rumors that the battle at Jena was not going well.
Right.
And then, they're kind of looking over their shoulder about that. The French, I don't know if you call it fanatical, but the French resistance was, I'm sure, frustrating, for the Prussians. Here they have all the advantages,
Yeah.
and Davout just had a knack. Let's give it up for Davout. He had a knack for having sort of a sense, a feel of how this battle was going, and then realized, even though they had been so punished all day long, around that 10:30, 11 hour, as you mentioned, he just had a feeling that, okay, the counterattack is going to be the thing to do here. Because I'm not sure any one of us would be outnumbered 3-1 and seeing a plane just stuffed with Prussians that you would say, okay, let's go on the attack.
Right.
But he does, and it's that portion of the Prussian army there at Auerstedt just melts away, streaming to the northeast, fleeing the battlefield.
Right. Well, let's discuss our friend Marshal Bernadotte, the Prince of Porto-Novo. He was in the area. His forces, no doubt, probably heard the cannon fire of Marshal Davout and Auerstedt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Napoleon likes people to follow orders. He doesn't like a whole lot of improvisation, but he does allow it. Do you think Bernadotte should have come to Davout's aid?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's indefensible that he didn't. And we have archival information that, in fact, there were, they could hear the guns. They could hear the action at Auerstedt.
Yeah, and I think Davout sent off messengers, requesting help. Did he not?
Yes, absolutely. Frenetic messages.
Yeah.
And they would only come from Davout because, of course, Napoleon was unaware that of Davout's situation. Napoleon was still under the impression that he had defeated the main Prussian body.
Yeah. Yeah, and I read that Bernadotte just kept telling Davout's messengers, like, never fear, we'll be there. And then he just never marched over there, which is, a court-martial worthy. So let's get into that. Napoleon hears of Davout's victory over this large force from one of Davout's aides, and he famously says, quote, "Your marshal must be seeing double," end quote, which is a gentle ribbing of Davout's famously poor eyesight. But he also hears of Bernadotte's inaction and allegedly debates a court-martial. But like you said, Bernadotte's married to Desiree Clary, who's Napoleon's former lover. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
Why do you think Napoleon forgave his marshal here?
Well, I mean, at the moment, he was furious. And the emperor had a legendary temper himself. And he was furious. And I think at the moment was super pleased to put Bernadotte under court-martial and put him in front of a firing squad. But I think, as Napoleon's way, he did sometimes take a deep breath and reconsider the situation. And I'm convinced, I don't have a lot of solid evidence for this, but I'm convinced that it was Bernadotte's ties to Desiree and Desiree's sister being married to Joseph that ultimately spared him a court-martial.
Right, right.
Well, but Napoleon did offer to, and it was Davout's Third Corps that got to occupy Berlin. They were the first French forces into Berlin, specifically to reward Davout for the victory at Auerstedt.
Yeah, and I think the criticism stung Bernadotte. Like, he and Marshal Soult Murat conduct the famous Pursuit of the Three Marshals, where they mop up the remaining Prussian army units. I think Bernadotte probably knows he got away with one right there.
Well, yeah, and in a weird sort of a way, it was fateful for him because, as you know, as the French are mowing the Prussians down and chasing them, it's a headlong flight into Prussia and into deep Prussia. And France violated Swedish Pomerania on the north coast of Germany there, in part chasing Prussian troops. And it was Bernadotte's good treatment of the Swedish officers and prisoners that brought Davout to the attention of the Swedes. And ultimately, when it became time to look for a replacement, because their previous king had died insane and childless, they remembered Bernadotte and made the offer later on in the empire. So funny, these twists of fate and how they worked.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to my last question. What do you think the legacy is for Jena Auerstedt?
There are a lot of legacies here. First of all, it obviously, I mean, the army of Frederick the Great, in a sense, the memory perhaps not the memory, but the functioning, Frederick's state is dead. Frederick's army is dead at this point. It's a completely new Prussia after this. And in fact, the Prussia that gets created in the wreckage of this is eventually going to be the Prussia that leads to German unification in the, in the 1860s and 70s, giving birth to the modern German state that we have today.
Mm-hmm.
So many reforms, defeats of such magnitude really involve some pretty intense soul searching. And the Prussians completely remade the army after the defeat at Jena and Auerstedt into a more modern force similar to what the French were doing. They started to harness the sort of nascent sense of nationalism, German nationalism,
Right.
that was growing during the time period. None of this would have been popular or possible before the destruction of the Prussian army at Jena and Auerstedt.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like before the battle, I think a lot of people thought, oh, the Prussians will just roll over them. They're the best trained army in the world, and it didn't happen that way.
Yeah, and Napoleon had a healthy sense of respect for the Prussian army. I don't think he approached this. I think his scorn that he held for the Spanish is legendary, and he did not have that same impression of the Prussians. He was. He held a great deal of, he personally respected Frederick the Great, did a lot of reading about Frederick the Great, took his sword and sash with him back to Paris after capturing it. So I think the Napoleon and the French had a lot of respect for at least the potential of the Prussians. But, as we see it didn't work out. The Prussians did not keep up with the times.
Yeah, there's that great quote from Napoleon when he visits the tomb of Frederick, and he says, "Hats off, gentlemen. If you were alive, we wouldn't be here."
Yeah.
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 Yeah. No, it's just an interesting twin battle. We don't get a lot of those in the Napoleonic Wars, and it's just interesting that they were kind of two boxers like feeling each other out like in a ring, and then they kind of just came together in that one day epic twin battle right there, and it was just just monumental for Davout, and really cemented his career as one of the best in Napoleon's army.
Absolutely. And this battle is great because it shows simultaneously, I mean, why the French were so ascendant in the earliest part of the empire, the structural advantages they have in terms of their organization, how that organization made itself felt on the battlefield in terms of marching speed and, response flexibility and all of those things that made the French army so dominant in the early part of the empire. But it also reveals, a lot of the structural problems or a lot of the problems that are going to start plaguing the empire, certainly later on, the rivalries between the marshals and the weakness of the system when Napoleon isn't on the battlefield to command personally.
Right.
And certainly an erosion over time of the quality of the French army because it belonged, as you mentioned, the French, train relentlessly. But, once the Austerlitz campaign starts, the French are going to be in the field continuously, the second half of 1805, all of 1806, into 1807, and it's not June until June of 1807 when they finally wrap up the campaign.
Right.
And you've had so many losses at that point, and a lack of training time, and so the French army ultimately, when this campaign is finally wrapped up, isn't the same quality as the one that starts in 1805.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. It's hard to replace, even in victory, some of the great leaders you lose in these battles. Yeah, this is good stuff, Charles. I appreciate you giving us the lowdown on Jena Auerstedt. And
well, I appreciate you inviting me. It's a fantastic battle, and Davout. I have not said enough about Davout. Probably some of that's because of my personal preference for Marshal Massena being the greatest of Napoleon's marshals. But I mean, Davout did miracles here. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know that anybody else would have had the sang-froid to sit there and take that kind of punishment. And probably more impressively, look at the might of the Prussian army, 3 times your size, and say,
Mhm.
all right, boys, we're going to plant the flag here and we're going to make our stand here.
Yeah, and I think, like you're saying, Massena was one of the best ones, but a lot of people say, "Oh, well, Davout sometimes he's overrated." Well, Napoleon, for many years, just automatically put Davout's corps on the right because he knew it was his best unit and never had to worry about his right flank. It was
Right.
always Davout. Yeah.
Davout was a master tactician, and again, with ably aided by Gudin, Friant, and Murat,
Yep.
and just and of course, all of those 3 divisionals ended up having illustrious careers.
Yep.
Gudin, unfortunately, dying in Russia, but I know Murat went on. Well, I think Murat and Friant both went on to command guard units. So, just tremendous.
Yeah.
Hats off to Davout. I
Yeah.
mean, amazing.
Soldiers that served under him, all the privates and corporals, fantastic work at Auerstedt.
Well, if you were going to be a French soldier in any French corps, you want to be in Davout's corps because that's the corps that's the best. It's the best taken care of. It's the best drilled. It's just simply the best.
Yeah, agreed. Yep. Well, again, if you want to follow Charles on Twitter, it's Bubbles Vampire, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And he's been great, and we love having him on the show. Charles, thank you so much.
Thank you. I should mention, I've also made the jump to Blue Sky as well.
Okay. So look for Charles on Blue Sky as well.
Yep.
All right, my friend. Well, we'll talk soon, and thank you so much.
Thanks, John.